Okay. Okay, let's get started. Yep. Oh, it worked for me, thank you. It's not a big deal, but. All right, so let's go get this. All right, so we are starting our new unit, okay, which you, of course, have to study out for. The new unit is going to be the emergence of the Americas and global affairs. So, like the previous unit, which was the U.S. Civil War, we're going to spend some time on this. We're going to be going to a lot of different areas. But for today, the main focus of today, and I think it's an interesting focus, is, there it is, U.S. expansionist foreign policy. So that is what we're going to be looking at least this week. We're going to look at how the United States not only became kind of an influential power in world affairs, kind of how did the United States going from a more minor power to now one of the world powers, okay? But we're going to look at how their foreign policy, kind of starting in the late 19th, early 20th century, became more expansionist. So this is a pretty important time in American history. Some people would argue, some historians say, this is the moment that the United States, in many ways, became a world power. Okay? All right, so what we're going to start with is this. Why? Okay, starting in really the late 1800s, the United States becomes an imperial power, something that, historically speaking, at least by some estimations, we had never been. Now, obviously, there is an argument to be made that, well, what about all that other Western expansion that we've talked about so far? You know, Western expansion into the Western territories like California and Texas, you know, does that count as imperialism? There's certainly an argument to be made that it is, but for whatever reason, historians have kind of separated that expansion from what we're going to look at today, which is mostly overseas expansion. But certainly, it's interesting to think about why. Why do we differentiate? There's a lot of different arguments to be made there. Okay, but our focus is, we've already talked about that, our focus is going to be mostly on why all of a sudden, starting in the late 1800s, did the United States go kind of on this spree of overseas expansion. And we're going to look at the causes here now. All right, so for the first one, and this is a cause of many of the things we'll always talk about, because economics always plays a role, because economics is, you know, how do you meet your needs? Okay, we have to consider economics, and a lot of you were kind of diving into the textbook yesterday and doing your study guide, and you found that the very, very first section we were asking me questions about was about economics. It was about big business and the Industrial Revolution and vertical and horizontal integration. You're like, why am I reading about this? Doesn't seem to fit. So what you have to know, if you don't know, is starting in the second half, really, of the 19th century, after the Civil War, we saw in the United States industry and big business really explode. Okay? You know, the Industrial Revolution began before that for the United States in the early 1800s. But it isn't until the late 1800s that we really see the United States emerge as this dominant industrial power after the troubles of the Civil War, where the United States became one of the leading industrial powers of the world. And as you can see from this graph, as we get to the turn of the century, in the 1900s, the amount of materials that were being both imported and exported just dramatically increases, which, you know, is kind of indicative of our growing economy. The United States was becoming one of the world's largest oil producers, one of the largest steel producers, things like that. So we were becoming this major industrial power. And you think, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, as our economy grew, there was the belief in order to keep pace with progress, we would also need to expand. We would need to expand our markets. We would need not only more people to sell to, but the United States alone and our existing overseas contacts were not enough. We might have to expand our markets to new territories to keep up with the economy, or it would stagnate. Also, the Industrial Revolution was fueled by raw materials and resources. And look, if you run out, you're out of luck. So expanding our territory and getting more lands would also fuel these profits. And that was one of the big focuses. I mean, the late 19th century, and I know for a lot of you who didn't have a U.S. history class in high school, you know, this was the time of big business, you know, big names. They're in your book, people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Vanderbilt, people who, these captains of industry that kind of helped build the country, right? And of course, the beginnings of the corporate climate that we even have today. So something that we take for granted today and just assume, you know, is American, that kind of first appeared in the late 19th century. And it's going to fuel imperialism because overseas expansion is going to be seen as in service to U.S. economic needs. All right, we also have ideological reasons. That's the term your book uses, but it's a good one. There are ideological reasons why the United States also looked to start expanding in the late 19th century. First of all, we have to consider some political and ideological ideas that came back from prior. So let's talk about the Monroe Doctrine for a minute. In fact, I actually talked briefly about the Monroe Doctrine last year, briefly when we were talking about the Cold War. So it might be something that you remember hearing, but you probably don't know a whole lot about. So in the 1820s, let's go back in time a long, long time ago to the 1820s. In the 1820s, the United States was still a relatively young, up-and-coming country. We weren't the United States that we are today, where we have just tremendous influence on the global stage. In fact, in the 1820s, we were not really that well-respected a country still. Okay, we were still on the up-and-coming. Okay, so in the 1820s, there was fear amongst American leaders that after the Napoleonic Wars, the Napoleonic Wars were a series of wars fought in Europe that really destroyed much of Europe and distracted much of Europe for a long time. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, there was a fear that European nations would once again set their sights on the Americas for colonization, as they had in previous eras. And now that the United States had been formed and won our independence, we were fearful that if European nations started coming over to the Americas again and started trying to colonize the Americas and reclaim territories they had lost, particularly many of the former colonies in Latin America, that it could somehow threaten our independence. We didn't like the idea of Europe meddling in American affairs. We wanted to kind of keep the Americas as our own backyard. So in 1823, President Monroe, who was our president at the time, if you're not familiar with him, he issued a warning, a statement, if you will, called the Monroe Doctrine. And what the Monroe Doctrine said was essentially to Europe, stay out. The Monroe Doctrine was a warning to Europe that any attempt by Europe to colonize or reestablish colonies or territories in the Americas would be perceived as a direct threat to the United States. It was a threat. It was a warning. Okay? So essentially, Europeans, stay out. And if you want to know specifically which country he was aiming it mostly at, although he didn't say this at the time, it was more of a general statement, it was actually mostly aimed at Russia. You know, after the Napoleonic Wars, you don't even know the details, but after the Napoleonic Wars, Russia emerged as a major influential power in Europe, and Russia was making some inroads into the Americas, particularly up here in the Alaskan territory. Russia was creeping up from here, and there was a fear that, okay, maybe they'll start moving down south, and maybe they can even threaten American autonomy if given enough time. So, with that being the case, the United States issued this warning. Now, I will say this. In 1823, when the Monroe Doctrine was issued, and by the way, presidential doctrines, we talked about them last year, you might remember. We talked about something like the Nixon Doctrine and things like that. Remember, a doctrine is just something that a president says, usually in a speech, and all of a sudden it just kind of becomes the policy of the United States. It's not a binding law or a contract or a treaty. It's just like, okay, the president said it, let's go with that for a while. But the Monroe Doctrine becomes pretty important because it will guide American foreign policy, really, for the better part of 100 years. And later on, we won't probably talk about it today, but later on, other presidents are going to piggyback off of it and they're going to add to it. It's going to become really, really important. Okay? But at the time the Monroe Doctrine was said, it really didn't have a whole lot of global impact. The United States warned Europe to stay out, but we really didn't have the military might to really back that up yet. Yes, we could issue warnings, but in reality, this warning largely went, for the most part, unnoticed by Europe. So you probably think, why is it important? Well, it's important because later, when the United States does become a world power, which we're going to get to here today, okay, now those words now have teeth. And now all of a sudden, we're going to put Europe on notice and say, hey, we're not messing around. This is our territory. And then that will begin to guide foreign policy more. So just be aware, it's background context now, but it's going to become more important later. Now, the other one is one you are already familiar with, which is Manifest Destiny. We talked about this in the Civil War. Manifest Destiny, of course, was the idea that the United States had this, in some cases, God-given right, it was seen, to expand and conquer all of the territories of the North American continent. Basically, that the United States should stretch from sea to shining sea. And we already know that Manifest Destiny was a big driving force in the 1840s and 50s. It guided Western expansion. It's what led to all that Western expansion, which eventually led to, of course, the troubles of sectionalism and slavery and eventually the Civil War. Okay? But that's an ideological thing. Now, you might be saying, what does this all have to do with anything? Well, let me get to that. We're going to be talking about imperialism in a minute. The Monroe Doctrine is going to be used as a justification for U.S. intervention in other lands and territories and countries because it's seen as being kind of a defensive move against other countries trying to take advantage of us. We need to act first. We need to colonize first before the others do it. Okay? And then this one, Manifest Destiny, look. Eventually, as you guys know, the United States did move from sea to shining sea. Once we hit California, okay, we're out of land, essentially. So, think about this, and this is a comment I always make in my other class as well, is for generations, Americans were told, go west, go west, go west, manifest destiny, expand, expand, expand. And all of a sudden, nowhere else to go. You know, it's kind of hard to flip a switch and turn that mindset off. And it's kind of interesting, and I'll give you a fact right here. In 1890, The U.S. Census, you guys know what that is, right? It's where the government counts up all the people and everything every 10 years. In 1890, the U.S. Census declared for the first time in American history that there was no more frontier, meaning there was no more territory out west that was unconquered. Basically, everything from the east coast to the west coast was largely settled. Okay, there was nowhere a place where you could step over a line and now you were in the great unknown anymore to conquer the wilderness. That's gone. It's all settled. It's kind of interesting to me, and this is kind of my little take on things, is in 1890 the frontier comes to an end. And then also in the 1890s, that's when the United States also starts setting its sights beyond the contiguous United States. And I don't think that's, happenstance. I think that's by design. We ran out of land to conquer, Western expansion came to an end, and now we are going to set our sights at things abroad. So keep that in mind as we go forward. That's an ideological concern. Any questions on that before we move on? Thank you. All right, let's go on to the next one. Also, one of the things driving imperialism was expansion as your book refers to, quote, a moral duty. This is where things start to get kind of dangerous as well. So one of the arguments made also in the 19th century is that the United States had a moral duty to expand. Now, what does that mean? Many people in the United States, and also European countries as well, as you can see from this graphic here, which I've used from the time, argue that Western states, like the United States, like Great Britain, which is also being depicted, had a duty to expand because they argued, and you'll see why this is such dangerous thinking, they argued that the United States culture, our political systems, our economic systems, were the greatest in the world, and that we had a moral duty to spread these systems and these ideas to other people around the world. There was a view by many in the West that other indigenous people of other territories that did not have these same belief systems were somehow inferior, that their political systems, their culture was lesser, and that Western civilization and what the United States represented was the greatest systems on earth, and we had to spread them. Okay, and that we would be doing a favor to these cultures by coming in and saying, hey, guess what? You're doing it wrong. Adopt this system. Or your religion is wrong. You need to learn about this. Okay? Now, obviously, this is kind of an antiquated idea, which is why here at the bottom, much of this thinking was fueled by a concept we call social Darwinism. Now, I can't remember if we've talked about social Darwinism or not. I've talked about it in so many classes it all blurs together. But social Darwinism is that idea, remember, where you apply, we haven't talked about it, I know we haven't, just talked about it faster. Social Darwinism is that belief of applying, Darwin's theories of natural selection to the human world and arguing that, look, in a natural system, there shouldn't be artificial things in place to really help those who don't have, the abilities that others do. It argues, if taken to its fullest extent, that some people, some groups maybe, some races even, if you really go down that rabbit hole, might be just naturally better than others. And as such, that is the natural order of things. And if some groups just naturally prosper more than others, it's not because of luck. It's because they're just better. They're smarter, or their abilities are better, or whatever. Okay? Now, this thinking is largely dismissed now and outdated, right? And you can kind of see why. If you take social Darwinism to its furthest extent, you get into some pretty racist stuff. And sure enough, many of the people who subscribe to social Darwinism in the 19th century also subscribe to ideas that we would today consider racist. White supremacy, eugenics, things about natural selection and selective breeding to breed a master race, if you will, like the Nazis did. So this stuff is all dismissed today. This is all bunk science. I just want you to be aware of this. This is all dismissed today. But in the 19th century, there were people who were teaching this in universities as hard science. Like, no, it's not an opinion, it's a fact. So if you subscribe to these ideas, there's this argument to be made, and people believed at the time, that U.S. culture and U.S. political systems are just the best, and we have a moral duty to spread them to indigenous people of other lands. Right? And you can look at this cartoon, and this cartoon is, of course, filled with racist caricatures, but it is relevant to the time. This idea that countries like the United States, here's Uncle Sam, or Great Britain, were actually taking, by colonizing other territories, what they were actually doing was they were lifting these people up and civilizing them. Now, obviously today, that would be considered very offensive and racist and ethnocentric, but again, in the time, this was a very common thought, and it drove a lot of policy. We're actually going to look at some of this later. We'll look at documents in which people are saying things like that. I mean, look at these cartoons. Here you see Uncle Sam. On his back, he's carrying all these caricatures, racist caricatures of indigenous groups, some of which we'll be talking about today, and he's carrying them over the rocks of oppression and ignorance and barbarism. Like, that's really offensive to accuse the indigenous people of a place like Cuba, oh, you're barbaric because you don't have our same ideas. And where are they carrying them? Well, if you look up here, they're carrying up the mountain to civilization. So this idea was very complex. In fact, not to go too far on this, but there was a very, very famous popular poem written in the late 19th century by Rudyard Kipling. You guys know Rudyard Kipling? Probably most famous for The Jungle Book. You guys know The Jungle Book probably, right? He wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden. Very famous poem, in which he basically argued that white societies had a duty, it was their burden to uplift non-white societies, right? And of course, the assumption there is that non-whites were somehow inferior, right? And again, today we would dismiss that, but back then that was a very complex thought. All right, last one before we move on is military and strategic reasons. This one's a little bit more straightforward. So also in the 19th century, there was the argument being made that if the United States wanted to be a world power, or remain a world power maybe, the United States needed to expand because military strength, military force requires territory, especially now in this new modern era, okay, of the turn of the century. That was modern for them, right? So one of the things that fueled this was not just resources, but your Navy, okay? For example, some of the leading military minds of the day, including a very prominent naval officer named Alfred T. Mahan, who was in your book. He wrote a very famous book talking about this called The Influence of Sea Power on History. That might be something you may want to know, so make sure you pick that up when you are doing your reading. But a lot of people like Alfred T. Mahan argued that what really determines whether a country is a great power or not is the size and strength of its Navy. Right? Now think about that for a minute. Not the Army, definitely not the Air Force because there are no airplanes yet, right? But the Navy. And that makes sense because look, if you're going to be a world global power and you want to project your power on other countries, you better have a Navy that is strong enough, big enough, and has enough range to basically force your policies on others. Okay? You know, for example, if the United States needs to go to war in Asia, you know, it's going to need a Navy to do that. A big, modern Navy. And if you have a big, modern Navy, you can't just have the ships. What else do you need to go along with the ships?
People.
You need people. What else? Ports, good, and fuel and resources, right? You can't wage a war from the United States to Asia. That's too far. You're going to need bases in between. So securing lands in places like Hawaii or the Philippines will extend your reach. It will give you the ability to project power around the world. Now, you don't have to look far from this, an example as to see this is true. The United States today is a prime example of this. Now, we don't just rely on our Navy, although we do have the greatest Navy in the world still in the United States. But we have military installations all over the world. There are military bases everywhere. Okay? We have some of the largest reach. And the reason for that being, we even have military bases, you know, tons of foreign countries, right? And the reason for that is by having those bases there, that means we can launch military operations virtually anywhere in the world in a very quick amount of time. We don't have to do a whole lot to set up a base operation. We've got places to operate from. All right? So in the modern sense, we have that, but where that kind of idea began was really around the turn of the century. You know, the United States, if it wants to be a true world power, like others, like let's say Great Britain, which historically is one of the world's greatest powers, we're going to need to expand. We can't do it just from the United States itself. We're going to need more land, we're going to need to build up our Navy, and we're going to need coal to fuel that Navy. We're going to need eventually oil, right? We're going to need all, and as you guys said, we're going to need people. People are a resource, and expanding your territory also expands the resources of people. So this is also going to be a big influence. Still is today. Again, one of the reasons why we have still today the most advanced and largest Navy of its kind in the world. So something to consider. All right, any questions on any of these causes? So that kind of sums it up, kind of three big, long-term, if you will, causes of U.S. imperialism and foreign policy. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start getting into specific examples. So here's your supporting evidence, right, of territories that the United States acquired in this time. All right, let's get into this. First one is Hawaii. U.S. annexation of Hawaii. All right. Here we go. All right, so let's talk about this. So prior to U.S. annexation of Hawaii, the United States already had a lot of involvement and interest in Hawaii, going as far back really as the early 19th century. First of all, take a look at this map here, and you can see why. Hawaii, sometimes it was called the Crossroads of the Pacific, which is, I think, a really good nickname, as you can see, was kind of located right smack dab in the middle of the Pacific between the Americas and Asia. As such, that meant it would be an ideal place as kind of a stopping point for refueling for any ships looking to do commerce with Asia, which of course was a growing, lucrative business, or any military presence that might need to project force on Asia. Now, for decades, Americans had been going to Hawaii. There was already a lot of Americans in Hawaii. Starting off in the early times, many American missionaries went there to spread Christianity, which was a growing presence there. But really by the mid-1800s, there was a lot of American business interests in Hawaii. There was a lot of American people growing fruit and sugar and things like that. So there was already prominent American business interests in Hawaii, but Hawaii was not American territory. In fact, by the 1890s, as you can see from this cartoon over here, Hawaii was really nothing more than what we call an American protectorate. And a protectorate is a territory that is not actually belonging to a country. It doesn't belong to us, but it's basically under our protection and influence. It's basically just shy of being ours. Okay, if you look at this cartoon, here you have, again, a racist caricature of a Hawaiian ruler, in this case probably Queen Lulukalani, that's the name right there. That was the last Hawaiian monarch. But here she is, and she's actually being propped up by American soldiers with their bayonets. And the cartoon is arguing essentially that while Hawaii is an independent state, American influence there is so great, and our strength is so great there, that really we are the ones holding that country, that government together. But again, as I said, this was not an American territory. In fact, Hawaii was still very much a monarchy. And again, the last monarch of Hawaii, you can see here, Queen Lulukalani. Now, in the 1890s, the growing American influence and presence in Hawaii began to lead to some rumblings about maybe Hawaii should become American. Now, you can't just take it. I mean, I guess you could. That would look really bad. Okay? And at the time, at least many American political officials did not have the desire to just simply seize Hawaii. There was American business interest there, but again, the presidents of the 1880s and 90s weren't too keen on annexing Hawaii or doing anything to do that. All right, but despite that, there were very many Americans who wanted to because they thought it would benefit American business. Now, one of the biggest concerns came when there was so much Western influence in Hawaii that Hawaii was virtually being controlled by Westerners. Despite it being not American, there was so much of an American business interest there that many Hawaiians came to realize, uh-oh, we're losing control of our own country. Most of the money is being gobbled up by a Western presence. And in fact, one of the last things that Queen Lulukalani did before she was deposed was she actually began to advocate for this idea of Hawaiians kind of taking back Hawaii. Meaning, if anyone's going to profit off of Hawaiian resources and soil and products, it should be Hawaiians. She had kind of this thing of Hawaii for the Hawaiians, which seems like a pretty non-offensive thing to say, right? Like, hey, shouldn't Hawaiians benefit off of their own sweat and toil? But that did not sit well with American businessmen because American businessmen knew, hey, if we go down that road, we might get kind of pushed out. So, in the 1890s, we start to see some things happen, which will eventually lead to her overthrow. It starts in 1890 with a tariff. Now, this is the boring part. So, in 1890, the United States Congress passed a new tariff. Our review time from earlier this year, a tariff is a tax on imports, foreign goods. This new tariff, called the McKinley Tariff, named after the member of Congress, William McKinley, who sponsored it, who will later become president, was a very high tax on foreign goods. Means if you were producing something outside the country and bringing it into the United States, you had to pay a high tax, which meant that cut into your profits. So if you are a business person doing business outside the United States, you did not probably like the tariff very much because it was taking away money from you. You might think, what does this have to do with anything? Well, any businessman, American or not, operating in Hawaii would be subject to this tariff. So American fruit growers or sugar growers or whatever they are, anyone who's growing crops or producing anything in Hawaii and then sending it to the United States is paying this tax. And they don't want to pay the tax. Now, there's only two ways you can get around this. One is the tariff has to go away, which, I mean, it's there. Congress wasn't going to take it away. The other option is, what if Hawaii all of a sudden became American territory? Now all those producers are no longer considered foreign, are they? They're now considered American. And now you don't have to pay the tariff anymore. It's all about dollars and cents, right? So this is wild, but this is actually what happened. In 1893, American businessmen in Hawaii managed to put together a force, and it used some military forces, the actual American soldiers that were present there, but they actually backed a coup or an uprising, and they actually overthrew the Hawaiian government. Businessmen, not a country, not an army, but businessmen overthrew the legitimate government of an independent country. It's kind of hard to believe, but it actually happened. And that just goes to show you just how much power and influence business interests, foreign business interests, had in Hawaii. Okay? Now, as a result of this, Queen Lulukalani was deposed, and a new government was established. As you can see here, one of the businessmen was this guy, Sanford Dole, like the Dole Fruit Company, right? You ever heard that name? They declared Hawaii now an independent republic. Now, Hawaii is still not American territory. It is still independent because, look, you can overthrow a government, you can declare yourself independent, but that doesn't mean the United States has to accept you. Okay? But starting like in 1894 when they overthrew the government, many of these business people now began petitioning the U.S. government and said, all right, we're independent, but we want to join you. Now, in 1894, there wasn't a tremendous amount of political drive or support in the United States to annex Hawaii. Okay? For example, President Cleveland was not in favor of it. He did not think it would be in the best interest of the United States at the time. However, within about 4 years, okay, the political winds shifted. There was more growing support for U.S. imperialism for all the reasons I've already talked about. And a new president, President McKinley, the same McKinley who passed the tariff, although it's actually unrelated, he was more sympathetic to this. So it was very clear that things were changing. So in 4 short years, the United States changed its mind, and in 1898, Hawaii was now formally annexed. So as a result, Hawaii now became officially U.S. territory, and guess what? All those business interests no longer had to pay the tariff tax. They got what they wanted. Okay, so their profits skyrocketed. And of course, Western influence there, American business interests, they profited. So that will continue to go on for quite some time, and even today, there's even, concerns and bad blood even left over from that. There's many, Native Hawaiians who are, still upset that, they feel like, historically Native Hawaiians were dismissed. They didn't get their day, and that's probably a fair concern, something that we would have to probably look at. But that's how Hawaii eventually became a U.S. territory, and of course, much later it will become a U.S. state, and we'll talk about that later. But for now, it is an American territory, just like we have lots of other American territories in our states. Puerto Rico, for example, which we'll maybe get to today if we have time. Questions on Hawaii? Pretty straightforward. Hawaii is kind of the beginnings of U.S. imperialism. I mean, there's other things before it. Alaska, for example, was annexed in the 1860s, and I would consider that also U.S. imperialism. But the era of U.S. imperialism that we're talking about right now, which is the turn of the century, is kind of beginning in earnest. And keep track of the year, by the way, 1898. 1898 is like the year the United States was like, oh, maybe we should be imperialists too. Everyone else is doing it. They're way ahead of us, right? That's going on already. Maybe we should jump into that game as well. Okay, this was, of course, during the great scramble for Africa, where European countries were dominating Africa. So we were late, but once we jumped in the game of imperialism, we played catch-up pretty quick. Questions? Okay. All right, let's get to the big one. This is the one I really wanted to get to. This is the major topic for today. Hopefully we'll finish it. Keep an eye on the time. The Spanish-American War. I would consider this to be the event that gives birth to the American imperialism movement. Even though the others predate it, this is it. This is where we jump in with both feet. So how did we get into a war with Spain, which eventually leads to the massive expansion of the United States? All right, so let's get some background. So first of all, let's talk about Cuba, because Cuba is going to be the place where this war is born. So a little bit of information about Cuba. Cuba at the time, 1898 and prior, was a territory of the Empire of Spain, Spanish territory. It was not independent, as you can see from this graph. Now, going back to really the 1880s and early 1890s, there was a lot of Cuban opposition to Spanish rule. Many Cubans, like other Latin American countries, yearned for independence. Yet, unlike other Latin American countries that had won their independence throughout the course of the 19th century, Cuba had not yet secured it. Cuba was still a colony of Spain. They did not want to be a colony. They wanted independence. Okay? However, Spain was not willing to let them go. And Spanish policies were seen as really being destructive to the interests of the indigenous people of Cuba. As you can see here you see Cuba, for example, cooking in the frying pan of Spanish misrule, and it's cooking over the fires of anarchy. So this makes it look really bad. Like this cartoon, which is a very pro-Cuban independence cartoon or U.S. view, is accusing Spain of really mishandling their rule of Cuba. Now, this went on for a long time. For the most part, Americans didn't care. Most Americans kind of turned a blind eye mostly to what was going on in Cuba for a long, long time. Americans typically are very sympathetic with independence movements. I mean, at least some, I guess I should say, not all. But America wasn't really too wrapped up in what was going on in Cuba for quite a long time. That is until the 1890s. In the 1890s, Spain, in an attempt to gain control of the situation in Cuba, began to take really heavy-handed measures there. This uprising in Cuba was becoming more and more of a threat. And as a result, Spain sent to Cuba a very large army of over 100,000 men to basically suppress any Cuban opposition there. And this turned into a very brutal and bloody guerrilla war. Spain was having a hard time with it. And they were afraid they were going to lose the territory. Now, as part of this war, Spain engaged in some practices that many alleged were war crimes and atrocities. Okay? For example, one of the officers, a general, Spanish general that was sent to Cuba by Spain, was this guy named Valeriano Weyler, who got nicknamed very quickly. They called him Butcher Weyler, which gives you an idea of what he was all about. And he used very, very heavy-handed tactics in an attempt to suppress Cuban resistance. For example, one of his policies was the creation of what were called reconcentration camps, which sound a lot like concentration camps, which are mostly associated with what?
Nazi Germany.
Yeah, Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, right? Not quite the same, but what it was, and this actually is very similar to some of the policies we talked about in Vietnam last year, was in order to pacify the populace, which it's a guerrilla insurgency just like in Vietnam, what Weyler did was he tried to kind of reconcentrate large amounts of Cuban people into condensed areas so that he could gain better control over them. The problem was the conditions in these camps were atrocious. Famine, as you can see from these artist renditions, I actually have pictures, but I didn't want to show them because I thought they were too graphic. Famine was widespread. People were starving to death. Disease was just absolutely rampant because of the conditions. I mean, people were dying in these horrifying conditions. And this wasn't a mystery. News of this, of course, eventually leaked out of Cuba. As you can see here, this was published in the New York Times. And Americans in their newspapers began to read about this. Yes?
What year was this?
So it was all throughout the 1890s, but the main year we're going to be focusing on is 1898.
So this is before Hitler, though.
Well before. Well before. Yeah. All right. Now, Americans were reading about this in newspapers, and newspapers at the time were engaging in a practice that is commonly referred to as yellow journalism. You'll want to know that. Yellow journalism is a major factor in causing the Spanish-American War. So you think, well, what is that, right? Let's talk about it. So yellow journalism is a phrase to describe a style of publishing that was used kind of around the turn of the century. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand what it is. We've talked about media. Yellow journalism was not fake news, to use a modern term, but it was sensationalism is probably the word I would use. And what I mean by that is, newspapers at the time, in an attempt to attract readers, people used to actually read a newspaper, imagine that. In order to attract readers, they would publish scandalous, sensationalized headlines that maybe didn't lie or fake the news, but they certainly may have, I don't know, maybe exaggerated is the word I want to use. So a common one I like to, and of course this has to do with the Spanish-American War, but here's a common one. Like, for example, talking about what's going on in Cuba. A newspaper could be very objective and say, Spanish policy in Cuba leads to, detainment of thousands of civilians. Okay, whatever, pretty bland headline. You might look at that walking down the street, you might see the headline and go, nah, that doesn't really interest me that much. But what if the newspaper headline told the same story and it said, butcher whaler massacres women and children in reconcentration nightmare. Ooh, I want to read that, right? That sounds way more exciting. It's the same exact story, but it's presented in a more sensational way to attract attention. And that is exactly what newspapers of the era did. They engaged in sensationalism to attract readers, and it worked. More and more people read newspapers and magazines and things at the time because of this style of journalism. Okay? People like William Randolph Hearst, okay, and Joseph Pulitzer, which were major media moguls who ran the biggest newspaper organization at the time, they used this journalism. And what they learned is also by using this style of journalism, not only did people read, but it also really influenced public opinion. Like by using that language, that loaded language, you can make people feel a certain way. In fact, you can even make a country go to war, as we're about to find. Okay? So yellow journalism is oftentimes considered to be one of the major causes of war because this style of reporting angered Americans, and Americans said, what's going on in Cuba? Maybe we got to get involved. Yeah, we're not Cubans, but they're our neighbors. They're fighting for independence like we once did, right? We did that too with Britain. Maybe it's our fight too. But we're not quite there yet. No one's done anything to us. Until some things start happening to us. Now, the first one's pretty simple. So, with all this going on in Cuba, many Americans were now paying more and more attention to what's going on in Cuba. And they were becoming increasingly concerned about the treatment of Cuban civilians. And they said, maybe we should do something, right? And in the midst of all this hoopla and all this concern and fear about what's going on in Cuba, some things started to happen that now create a division between the American government and the Spanish government. Now, one of those is this, which kind of has some parallels to something we talked about in World War I, the Zimmerman Telegram. This is called the Dulome Letter. So in the midst of all this lead up to the Spanish-American War, okay, it was eventually leaked out that a letter written by the Spanish ambassador, this guy, Enrique Dulome, he wrote a letter that was eventually leaked out and made it to the American press, in this letter, he criticized very overtly our president at the time, William McKinley. At the time, President William McKinley was our president. Now, McKinley had not been a strong supporter of U.S. intervention in Cuba. He was kind of trying to walk a fine line. He didn't want to alienate people who were isolationists. He didn't want to alienate interventionists. He just wanted to be kind of right down the middle. So he got all the voters. But in the Dulome letter, the Spanish ambassador criticized President McKinley. Basically said he was a two-face. Said McKinley's playing both sides. He's trying to whip up what he called the Jingos. The Jingos are the extreme nationalists who would probably want to go to war. He's trying to whip them up into a fury while at the same time trying to keep the other people on his side. Honestly, it's not that bad. If you actually read the text of the Dulome letter, it's by today's standard, we would laugh it off and go, this is nothing. Because, of course, today, political discourse is pretty nasty, right? There was just a debate the other day where they were using profanity on the stage, right, against each other. Like, that used to be, hey, you can't do that now. Do whatever you want. Nothing matters, right? But in 1898, this was a national insult, especially because Americans were already on edge. Had this letter been published like 10 years earlier, it probably wouldn't have made a lot of waves. But at a time when Americans were already mad, it just exacerbated that. It's like, wow, they really insulted us. They insulted our president. And people said, maybe we should do something about that. Now, this alone is not cause for war, but it doesn't help. In order for you to have a real cause of war, you really need something bad to happen. Well, sure enough, we're going to get that. Here we go. So in 1898, our main cause, happens, and that is destruction of the Maine. So in 1898, the United States sent a warship down to Cuba, the USS Maine.
They broke it?
They broke it? Yeah, they broke. Well, it got broke. Let's put it that way.
That's mean.
So the Maine was not there to engage in war. The Maine wasn't there to start a fight. The Maine was just there to kind of project American strength. This was an example of what we talk about this fast, gunboat diplomacy. When you want to kind of show off and flex on your enemies a little bit, you send one of your biggest, baddest warships and you park it there and you say, look what we got. And we've done it a million times. We do it today all the time. That's why we like to sail our aircraft carriers past China every once in a while. Hey, you see this? See what's going on? Just remember, that's there. Okay? We're not looking to start fighting. We just want to remind you. So we sent the Maine to Cuba as a show of force. Well, then one night, in 1898, mysteriously, as you can see from the picture there, the Maine explodes, destroys the ship, kills hundreds of American sailors. Now, the immediate reaction is, uh-oh, Spain has attacked us. And there was a very quick investigation, and the result of that investigation was the Maine was destroyed. And this is the investigation at the time, not a modern one. The investigation said the Maine was destroyed by a Spanish mine. That there was a mine, which is an explosive device placed in the harbor, and when a ship hits it, it blows up. Okay? So this was seen by Americans who believed that it was a mine, that this was an act of war. Spain had now attacked us, and that now we had a cause to intervene. Americans were really outraged. The rallying cry of the era was, quote, remember the Maine, like remember the Alamo, right? And to hell with Spain. Americans want to go to war. And I love this graphic. This kind of tells you how media and yellow journalism at the time looked at this. Here's Spain depicted as this monster. He's covered in blood. He's got a bloody dagger. And he's standing on the bodies, the grave, of the Maine sailors. Not killed, but murdered, right? Because murder's worse, right? Murder, you get killed in combat. We accept that. Murder, that's crime. So see how language matters? I would consider that kind of yellow journalism, right? So this was how most Americans perceived it. So in response to this, the people who were kind of saying, maybe we should go to war, and straddling McKinley, they said, okay, we can't ignore this. So in 1898, in response to the Maine, the Loan Letter, and all the yellow journalism, and all the rising arguments for intervention, the United States says enough's enough. McKinley goes to Congress, because of course Congress is the one that has to declare war, not presidents. McKinley goes to Congress and says, please, I would like a declaration of war, and they give it to him. So the United States will now go to war with Spain. This is a war that will last 1 year, okay, and that we will discuss more tomorrow. All right, so we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday. So we finished up yesterday. We were talking about American imperialism causes, and then we talked about some of the earliest examples of American imperialism. And we last finished with the United States declaring war on Spain in 1898 in response, largely, to the Spanish handling the situation in Cuba, growing concerns about that in the media, and then ultimately the kind of tipping point was destruction of the USS Maine, our warship, which mysteriously exploded, okay, while it was placed in Cuba, was blamed on Spain, despite there being no, evidence that guaranteed it. And of course, now modern evidence says probably not caused by Spain. But regardless, in that atmosphere of people wanting revenge and war and wanting to get involved, caused by all that yellow journalism we discussed yesterday, America decides to go to war. And I'll just go ahead and give you the overview before we get into the actual conflict, because we're not going to do an in-depth examination of this like we do other wars. But the Spanish-American War is really a very one-sided, short affair. From start to finish, it is largely dominated by the United States. This is why this war is sometimes called the war that really made the United States a more modern superpower. I don't know if I agree with that statement exactly, but it did kind of usher us onto the world stage. Hey, we're a premier power. We handled a European power so capably. Okay, but anyways, the Spanish-American War, it is fought over the course of 1898. It doesn't even last more than a year. Again, it's fairly short. One American official once called it a splendid little war, which is a weird way to describe a conflict in which a lot of people are going to die. But again, it just kind of shows you the nature of it. Now, there are two major theaters of war, meaning where the war was fought. Okay, the one that got the most attention was, of course, the one where the war was focused originally, which is right here in the Caribbean. Okay, so this is that theater, the Caribbean theater, and you can see most of the focus, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, most of the focus is going to be on, of course, Cuba, which is where this conflict really originated for the United States in many ways, and also Puerto Rico. Okay, now the other theater is going to be over here in the Pacific, in the Philippines. And in fact, it's kind of interesting that though the war in many ways was born out of what was going on in Cuba, with the Spanish mistreatment of the Cuban people, and of course General Weyler's reconcentration policy we talked about yesterday, and all the really horrible human rights abuses that were going on to the Cuban civilians. The United States did something really fascinating. Rather than doing the obvious thing and targeting Cuba, the very first strike the United States kind of used against Spain was actually in the Philippines. Now, the Philippines was also Spanish territory. And our Asiatic fleet, as it was called, actually set forth to attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. And there we won a stunning victory. Here it is. In the Battle of Manila Bay, our now modern state-of-the-art Navy. Remember we talked about yesterday in our causes of American imperialism, we talked about how, one of the main focuses or causes of it was this idea that if you want to be a great world power, you have to have a big, powerful Navy, lots of naval bases so that you can extend your reach. And the United States had bought into that. Remember Alfred T. Mahan, that book I talked about yesterday about the influence of superpower in history, which is in your textbook, by the way. You might want to use it to one of your vocabulary terms. He said, look, if you go back 150 years of history and you look at all the world powers, all the great powers, he said there's one thing they all have in common: dominance of the sea. Because remember, this is in the era before airplanes, satellites, rockets. You got to get somewhere, you got to go by boat. Okay? So this is a perfect example. The U.S. fleet, under Admiral Dewey, smashes, as you can see from this headline there, the Spanish fleet. The Spanish fleet was more antiquated old ships. We had modern steel-hulled ships, state-of-the-art for the time. I mean, it was really a lopsided fight. They didn't stand a chance. In a matter of hours, most of the Spanish fleet have been just wiped out. Okay? Now, this didn't mean that we could take the Philippines right away. Having a large navy didn't mean we had an actual infantry presence. But we would then later on go on to take the Philippines. That would be a major part of the war. Now, in the other theater, we weren't done. This was really where most of the attention was, even though we struck first in the Philippines. The United States also now focused on the Caribbean. And in Florida, hey, a little local history for you. That is where we had our staging ground. That's where we raised our armed forces. Now, I want to tell you this. In the late 1800s, the United States was not the United States of today in terms of its military might. When you actually look at our standing military forces in the 1890s, they're really small. Okay, we did not have a massive military ready to go like we do today. So we had to put that together. Okay, so a military force was quickly assembled, even though we were woefully unprepared, which back then, that was kind of our practice. We would declare war and go, whoops, we probably need to get ready for war. Okay, luckily, this war, we're not fighting a major foe that would give us a lot of trouble. But we put together an invasion force right here in Florida. And then that invasion force set out and launched attacks both in places like Cuba and in Puerto Rico. Okay? And though our fighting force was relatively small, we were far better equipped than the Spanish enemies we were taking on. But again, I think one of the things that this war is most known for is just how ill-prepared we were. Many soldiers lacked adequate training. Though we had better weaponry, even one of the things, and this is very famous, most of the deaths we suffered in this war had nothing to do with enemy gunfire. It happened really with our own issues with logistics. Most of the people died due to exposure in the heat in the Caribbean, mosquitoes, and contracting disease. More people died of disease traipsing around in the tropics of Cuba than ever were killed by Spanish gunfire. And that just goes to show you how ill-prepared we were. In fact, one of the horrible things about this war, and your book actually talks about it to its credit, our soldiers went in there wearing the old school wool, heavy uniforms in Cuba, right? So people were passing out from dehydration more than they were worried about being shot and killed by Spanish soldiers. But despite all those problems, we succeeded. We just outmatched the Spanish adversary. There are no pivotal, defining battles like you might see in another war that, just completely changed the course of the war. There's no turning point because it's not a war that had a turning point because it was one-sided. From start to finish, the United States commanded this war. And don't forget, this war was in our own backyard. It's just a little, hop, skip, and a jump to Cuba. It's 90 miles away from Florida. That might as well be American territory in terms of logistics, right? Spain has to fight this war across a giant ocean. And Spain knew, really, they were in trouble. I mean, there's probably a good argument to be made that Spain knew they were going to lose this war. So you think, well, if you know you're going to lose, why fight? Well, you still have to do something. Because if you don't, you look weak. And I know that's sad to say, but that's the case. Sometimes even when you know you're going to lose, you got to fight just to set the example. So there's no pivotal battles that to win the war. I mean, the Battle of Manila Bay we were talking about is probably the most important battle of the war. But there are some that kind of made history. Now, this one is probably the most famous battle, even though it doesn't win the war or anything. But the Battle of San Juan Hill is probably the most famous battle just because it became the stuff of legend. This is when one of our cavalry units, now cavalry units are supposed to fight on horseback. Horses never made it to Cuba. So they ended up fighting on foot, so whatever. But this is one of our cavalry units, the so-called Rough Riders. They have a cool name, okay, which are our sister school, right? Roosevelt, they're the Rough Riders. Anyone go to Roosevelt?
Yeah.
So did I went to Roosevelt.
I
thought they were
teddy bears. Yeah.
Did they change it or something?
I mean, when we were there.
Oh my God. Well, we used to be the Rough Riders. I'm bringing it back. So we're still the Rough Riders, but the Rough Riders, they charged up San Juan Hill and they defeated the Spanish forces that were in a entrenched position up there in this glorious battle, the one, acclaim for everyone involved. And of course, one of the people who got a lot of attention for this, one of the officers in charge was Theodore Roosevelt, which Roosevelt's named after. And part of the fame that kind of the attention he got from his involvement in this war and in this battle is actually what catapulted him to the vice presidency, which then eventually led to him becoming president and becoming one of our most famous presidents. All right? It's kind of weird that that's how it went, but that's exactly how it did. He actually resigned, not to go too far down this path, but Teddy Roosevelt resigned a very prestigious position in government as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I mean, he was a big mover and shaker. He said, I want to go see combat. He actually wanted to experience it. He was very much a person who favored war as a tool of policy. And in fact, there are the Rough Riders, as they were known, which was this kind of hodgepodge mix of all these interesting characters. They had everything from cowboys to ex-criminals, all kinds of weird people were involved in this, but they were pivotal in this battle. In fact, one of the things that is unknown, this is a very famous photograph. That's Teddy right there in the middle, Teddy Roosevelt, future president. Which the teddy bear is named after, by the way. So hence, I guess, why they're the teddy bears over there. One thing that's not known is, and this picture is actually very interesting, is that this famous photo is cropped. In fact, a lot of African Americans participated in this battle. But of course, because of the time and because of how history was perceived at the time and racism, a lot of times their roles were diminished. So it's just kind of interesting that that's something we're going to have to look at going forward throughout all history, is how are minorities affected by this kind of stuff. All right, so as I said, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this war because honestly, there's not much to say. I've already said it. Dominated by the United States from start to finish. So what is the result? Well, wars end in treaties. At least they're supposed to, if they're real wars. And this one does. And what an original name, the Treaty of Paris. There's not a ton of those in history. That's a joke. There's lots. You don't know that probably, but there's been many treaties of Paris. In fact, there's a Treaty of Paris in American history already. It's what ended the American Revolution, in case you didn't know, and gave birth to our freedom as a country. But anyways, the Treaty of Paris of 1898 is the treaty that ends the Spanish-American War. Okay? Now, it is, in many ways, one of the most consequential treaties in American history because of what it gives the United States. Now, remember, we largely entered this war, as you can see up here, to free Cuba from Spanish misrule. And that was achieved. Cuba was liberated. Cuba will go on to become, at least in name, an independent state. So this is really the beginnings of Cuban independence from Spain, which is good for them. It's what they wanted, right? But what does the United States get out of it? We'll talk more about Cuba here in a second because we're not done there. So Spain also, as a defeated power, was forced to relinquish some territory over the United States. So, for example, the United States was given, as a result of this war, we were given over to the territories of Puerto Rico and Guam, which to this day remain American territories. Okay? Both are American territories. They are not states, but they are American territories, which means while they are American, and we'll talk about what that, citizenship rights and all that, but they do not have all the same rights and privileges that a state would have. The most important being they lack representation in our federal government. Puerto Rico, for example, does not get to vote and send senators or representatives to Congress to make laws that essentially affect the whole country. And them, they go along for the ride. I always say Puerto Rico kind of just goes along for the ride, but they don't get a say, which is kind of a weird situation to be. I mean, they are essentially, for lack of a better term, they are still kind of a colony of ours, even though we don't like to use that because that's kind of a word that's got negative connotation. Yes?
Do all the territories of the U.S. have like a delegate that goes and sits in?
Yeah, so the thing we get, or they get, is they do get someone who speaks on their behalf, but that person has no actual real voting power. So yeah, they get someone who gets to go to Washington, D.C. and be their voice, like, hey, we need help. For example, like the damages caused by the hurricane. They can say, hey, we need help. The whole island is without power, right? But the problem is, at the end of the day, they don't actually have voting power. And I mentioned this before when we were talking about just politics in general. If you don't have binding voting power, it's a problem because people can ignore you if they want. And that has been kind of the problem, and that's why there's been debates, and we're not going to have this debate today, this might be a current events discussion in the near future, but there has been debates about, hey, maybe we need to grant statehood to these territories so that they have more of a say. But of course, granting statehood to these territories, and Puerto Rico being the most commonly referred to, has political, consequences. It might, one party might benefit, one party might be hurt by it. So there's reasons why, politically speaking, there might be a battle over this. So that's something to consider. Like I said, we'll probably discuss that at a later date in current events. But for the moment, they become American territories. Now, what about the Philippines? The Philippines is kind of a weird one. The Philippines is so far removed from the United States and the prime theater of war. There's a big question about what about the Philippines. I mean, the United States was essentially occupying it. We had largely wrested control of it from Spain, but do we just give it back? We can't just take it because that would look really bad. So eventually, it was what the negotiation was. Spain knew that they couldn't hold it. They really practically, they're probably going to lose it. So rather than lose space anymore, they sold it. So we also, in addition to getting Puerto Rico and Guam, the United States also gets the Philippines, but we pay, as you see there, $20 million, which I don't know what that is in modern day. It's more than that, but still, it's a steal. You get a whole country essentially for this lump sum. So that also becomes U.S. territory. Some of you might not have even known that. Now, I will say this, though, just for your knowledge. We'll get to this more later. Unlike the other two, the Philippines is no longer American territory. The Philippines is fully independent today. We do not control the Philippines in any way. We do still control the other two. All right, lastly, if I had to sum it all up, the Spanish-American War is what made the United States an imperial power. Yes, I understand the United States had acquired other territories, Alaska, for example. Hawaii predates this. But this amount of land grab all in one fell swoop marked the beginning of the United States going, okay, we can do more of this. And remember, imperialism doesn't just have to be we took over a country or land. Imperialism can be other things. It can be influence, right? Using your power to influence other countries, which is now where we're going to kind of go. We won't see a ton more of the United States actually taking land going forward. There's not much of that. But there is a whole bunch of, okay, we're going to tell you how to live your life or else. That's where we're going to kind of go in the near future. So some more things to consider, though. Almost done. The role of the United States had changed. This is a big shift. This is a monumental shift in American history. Okay? Up to this point, the United States had never really acquired territories with the idea that they would never become states. From our origins, it had always been the idea that any territory we get, one day would be open to statehood. Okay? And have equal participating power with other states. The inclusion of these new territories, there was this kind of shift because they were more foreign. Okay, there was this idea that maybe they are not going to be eligible for statehood the same. And of course, we have these debates today, but I'm talking about going back 100 years. So some people wondered, is this a turning point for the better or for the worse? I mean, remember, it's just like today. This divided people. It's not like everyone was like, oh yeah, this is cool. Yeah. I mean, there were people who were critical of this, very critical. This cartoon. If you can't figure out what it's saying, this cartoon is incredibly critical, right? And what I mean is the role of the United States, are we to be an imperial power? We had never been an imperial power. We used to vilify Great Britain, who dominated other countries and didn't give them rights. We said, hey, you can't do it. They did that to us, and we didn't like it, right? Now, we were kind of doing the same thing. What has changed? So some people wondered, is the United States to become this imperial power? And if you don't know what's going on here, this is President McKinley, who was president during the Spanish-American War. He's standing on the island of the Philippines, who have an incredibly offensive racist caricature of a Filipino, okay? Which, like I said, this is of its time, which racism was common, so we're not supporting that, obviously, okay? And then you've got these two ghosts overlooking his shoulder. Who's this guy? That's Julius Caesar, who history has many times condemned as kind of being, a tyrant. He dominated power, he expanded, he waged brutal wars to take land for Rome, right? You might not know all this, but you should probably know. Who's that?
Napoleon Bonaparte.
And of course, Napoleon Bonaparte, who in European history, for many, was also kind of similar. He waged terrible wars, conquered territory, tried to dominate all of Europe under French control. So this cartoon is saying, hey, is McKinley going to be a tyrant too? Is he going to be one of these people history looks back on? Now, what did the indigenous people of these territories think? Okay, well, here's the thing. A lot of the people in these territories thought, hey, we're getting our independence. The Philippines is a prime example. When the United States attacked Spain in the Philippines, what I haven't talked about and you need to know is the Filipino people, they rose up and they joined us. We had their backing. The Filipino people were like, yeah, finally, let's get rid of the Spanish. Right? Because they were existing under the idea that this was going to be their liberation. When the Philippines found out that they weren't getting their independence and rather the Spanish flag was coming down but the American flag was going up, they were not happy. And in fact, the same Filipino people who fought with us against the Spanish now actually rose up and fought a war against the United States. You might not even known about this war. Right? The Philippine-American War. Not a big war in American history that gets a lot of attention. We had to actually fight against the Filipino people to retain control of the Philippines. And here's a statistic that's mind-blowing, I think. No one talks about this war. Most of you probably never heard about it. More Americans died fighting this war than they'd ever died fighting the Spanish. This was a more serious war for us, right? So it's kind of crazy that it doesn't get attention, but I think probably why is because this war doesn't look that good, right? We're actually fighting to oppress a people who wanted to be independent. So that probably doesn't make it as popular as the Spanish-American War, where we were fighting to liberate people. You know, one of the guys we fought against, and you'll read about him in your book, is there was a Filipino nationalist who was our ally in the Spanish-American War. His name is Emilio Aguinaldo. He ends up being our enemy, right? Now, the United States will eventually win this war, and we do suppress Filipino opposition, and we will go on to dominate the Philippines all the way up until the post-World War II era. And some of you might even remember last year we talked about World War II. You'll know that the Philippines was American territory because, remember, we lost it to the Japanese temporarily. Remember that? Bataan Death March. Remember they took the Philippines. Douglas MacArthur left the island and had to come back and reclaim it. Remember that? So we do reclaim it during World War II, but then afterwards, remember, after World War II, there's a big movement in the world to decolonize, and we go along and say, okay, we'll give up the Philippines. But we don't give them all up. So just be aware of that. All right, let's finish up. So what else is going on? A lot of cartoons to use. This is a great era for political cartoons, by the way. So the American sphere of influence has grown. What I mean by it, if you're not familiar with that phrase, a sphere of influence is an area on the map, essentially, where a country dominates or influences or extends its control. Right? So our sphere of influence, as you can see represented by the bald eagle here, was now stretching from the United States down into Latin America. I haven't even talked about Panama yet. We'll do that later. But look, one of the wingtips extends way out in the Pacific and is reaching as far as the Philippines. Our reach has grown. We have become more powerful. We are an imperial power. Our reach, our resources. We have naval forces now in places like the Philippines and Hawaii, which means now in the future we can extend our military reach and deal with foreign threats. You know, you think about it. Talk about things you know. The Japanese attacked where to start World War II against the United States? Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. You think, well, all the places, why there? Because our reach into the Pacific was the greatest threat to them, right? So that just tells you how valuable these territories are. The fact that the Japanese would target Pearl Harbor and then, by the way, follow that with an invasion of the Philippines tells you everything you know. These places were strategically important to the United States. Okay? So there it is. U.S. imperialism has begun. We are now an imperial power. And I do think it's an interesting argument we're not going to get into today. And it's a very complex argument that can really, it can be hard to wrap your head around. But is this new? You know, and I know a lot of you didn't take a push with me, but if you took a U.S. history class and you did it in 8th grade, I mean, you know we have, as a country, going all the way back to the 1700s. We've been constantly expanding. When we talk about Western expansion, at least the Civil War, you know, why is this different? I mean, we did take lands away from people in the past. We took them away from indigenous people. We took them away from foreign European countries. You know, why is that not considered imperialism? I don't know. I don't have an answer. It's really the same. But there are differences, of course. The difference here being now we're really extending our reach beyond the contiguous United States. So maybe that's it. But honestly, I think there's a really good point to be made that is this a new era? Why do all history books call this the era of U.S. imperialism? Why is it the taking of Western territories of California? Why is that imperialism? Because there were people living there. They were owned by other countries, Mexico, Native Americans. I don't know. I don't know why history does it. I don't know. Just food for thought. But anyways, the new American imperialism, I'll call it the new imperialism, is now these things. Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. This is Hawaii, called the Sandwich Islands. And there's President McKinley serving Uncle Sam. Hey, what do you want off the menu? You want to eat the Philippines? Okay, let's go take it. And you notice Cuba's up there too. You say, well, hold up. Why Cuba? Cuba's not ours, but it might as well have been because we dominated it, which I'm going to get to here in a second. Now, did everyone agree with this? No. Just like today, Americans were divided. There was entire groups of people who said, this is wrong. It is not in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. It's not in the spirit of the Constitution. It's anti-American. So there was an entire American anti-imperialist league. And look at the year it was founded, 1899. Not surprising. That is the year after the Treaty of Paris. In response to the Treaty of Paris, many Americans said, we should not be doing this. Now, there's a lot of reasons why. Some people oppose it on the grounds of rights of these people. Some people might even support it for other reasons, racist reasons, like, hey, should we bring territories that are largely non-white under American control? There's a lot of reasons why people are anti-imperialist. Some would be considered more better or good than others. But for whatever reason, there were people who opposed this. And in fact, some of them were celebrities. Okay? These people are celebrities of their day. Now, we didn't have movie stars and sports athlete celebrities as much like we do today, but people like Mark Twain, you guys know Mark Twain, right? Famous author. He was very well known. Andrew Carnegie, the captain of industry, businessman. He and William James Bryan, who was a famous politician. There were a lot of people who said, we should not do this. And their main criticism, the biggest one that really got them going, was the Philippines. They said the Philippines just doesn't fit with the spirit of what America is in terms of it's so far away, should we dominate it? It's got a different, largely different culture and things like that. It just doesn't fit within, the scope of the United States, or should it, I guess I should say. But that was their big target. But I always like to bring this up because just be aware that history is no different than today. People have disagreements about what's going on. Okay, it just so happens at the time it would seem that politically speaking, most of the power was concentrated in people who were in favor of imperialism. People like President McKinley, and then later President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, not Franklin, were big time imperialists. In fact, that's actually, depends on how you view imperialism. One of the criticisms made of Theodore Roosevelt, one of our most celebrated presidents, is people say, maybe he went a little too far with the imperialism stuff. So it just depends on how you view that today. So just be aware of that. All right, let's finish up this stuff. What about Cuba? I keep mentioning Cuba. This is where it gets a little complicated. This is actually one of the most complicated things we have to talk about. So what was Cuban independence? So when we went into the Spanish-American War, right from the get-go, we already stated, when we joined that war, we said, even before the war was over, we said, we are not in this war to take Cuba away from Spain. We said that. We actually had what was called the Teller Amendment, which literally said that. It guaranteed that upon the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, Cuba would gain its independence. They would not become an American territory. This is why it did not become an American territory, because we said it right from the get-go. We couldn't go back on it now. But I just said a minute ago that it might as well have been, because we also made agreements with Cuba, who is now kind of at our service, because they kind of owed us. We told Cuba, hey, you're not ours, but you do got to play ball. Okay? And later on, the United States passed something called the Platt Amendment, which basically laid out the rules for Cuban independence. We told Cuba, basically, here's how you're going to exist. Now, some of you might be confused about this, because you say, whoa, hold on a second. I know that Cuba, throughout American history at various times has been on not good terms with the United States, right? We all know about the rise of communism, Castro, the Cuban Missile Crisis. That all comes later. That's a big fundamental shift. One of the reasons why the United States was so upset about that is it changed really our entire relationship with Cuba. Cuba, for like its first 50 plus years of its independence, it was dominated by the United States. Your book talks about this. American business moved in and dominated. Most of the farmland, most of the industry in Cuba was actually, the profits were mostly going into the hands of American businessmen. America was profiting off the hard labor and resources of Cuba. So it benefited us. It was a huge vacation destination for Americans in the first half of the 20th century. People were going down to Cuba. It was like the place to be, right? Until the revolution. So how is that possible? Well, the Platt Amendment said, look, we were afraid that other European powers might come in and try to dominate. So the Platt Amendment said, look, Cuba, you're not allowed to make any agreements with any foreign power. We prohibit it. He said, sorry, you're not. You can make deals with us, but no one else. This is how we came to dominate it. And if Cuba did anything that we disagreed with, or anything that could threaten that independence, like let's say Cuba entered into a deal with a foreign European power, like, we reserve the right to get involved in their affairs. Why? Because we could. We just said it. Okay? And our justification, to go back to yesterday, one of our justifications was an important thing we talked about yesterday, was the Monroe Doctrine. Remember that yesterday? Monroe Doctrine said, hey, Europeans, stay out of our American hemisphere. Well, if a European country tries to meddle in the American hemisphere, we're going to stop it. Because now, remember, in 1823, we couldn't back up the Monroe Doctrine. We can back it up now. How? Well, we got a big Navy. What are you going to do about it? Right? As Teddy Roosevelt called it, he called it the big stick policy. Right? Speak softly and carry a big stick. And that big stick he's threatening everyone with is his big Navy. Okay? Also, you might be familiar with this. You might say, hold on a second. Cuba doesn't like us very much. Or, it's more actually we don't like them very much at times. But you might be wondering, how is it that the United States today, you might have heard about, has a military base in Cuba? We have a military base. That's American soil. Guantanamo Bay. Gitmo, they call it. How is that possible? It's been there since the Cold War. There you go. So how is that possible? It goes all the way back to this. Even though we have been at times on the verge of war with Cuba, nuclear war at one point, right? We always had a military base that it was ours. By right, it was ours from these treaties we signed. We still have it today, although there's been a lot of focus on whether we should have it, should it go away. There's been talk about leaving the base, mostly because it was involved in some scandals during the War on Terror, where the United States was torturing detainees in the War on Terror. But it still exists, and we still own it. So no matter what's going on between us and Cuba, it's still there. And lastly, Cuba was not allowed to build up excessive public debt. You say, what would we care if they built up debt? Well, the fear was if they build up debt, it might come back to this. It might endanger its independence. What if Cuba borrows a bunch of money from England, and then they can't pay it back? What if England's like, okay, you can't pay it back, we're coming over. That violates the Monroe Doctrine. Now we got to fight England. No way, we don't want to do that. So we told Cuba, you better keep your finances in line so that we don't have to come fight. So just understand, Cuba was independent, air quotes, for the YouTube viewers. But the reality is, look, we were closely monitoring the situation. And not everyone liked that. Okay? Now what about Puerto Rico? Puerto Rico, unlike Cuba, was American territory. And by 1917, with the Jones Act, the United States extended citizenship rights to all Puerto Ricans. This, of course, goes all the day. So understand, I constantly see people make this mistake. I even see elected officials, this is the most humiliating thing, I see elected officials sometimes make this mistake because that's really alarming because they represent us. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. Okay, people who live in Puerto Rico are American citizens. They are us. Okay, they're not foreigners. It's not a foreign country. It is part of the United States. It is not a state, though. But they are still citizens, and they are protected by the protections of the U.S. Constitution, and so on and so forth. Okay, now that's today, and that was something that happened and evolved over time. That doesn't mean it was always the case. As you can see, citizenship rights, as this cartoon is portraying, and again, not a very kind cartoon, it's a caricature of the Puerto Ricans. And this is, by the way, take note of these cartoons. In almost every single cartoon, non-white indigenous people are portrayed as being almost childlike. You notice that? You've seen that in a couple of the cartoons? I think I got another one to show you. The idea is, one of the common themes, and now we're getting to some really heavy stuff, one of the common themes in imperialism is something called paternalism. You guys ever heard that word before?
Yeah.
Paternalism?
Yeah.
The idea that a father figure must kind of rule over you. And in this case, the father figure is the United States. And this is very much, really, where I want to use. I mean, it's really a terrible way to look at it because it's implying that indigenous people are so unable to rule their own affairs. It's almost like they're children. They have to be looked out by others. And, of course, a lot of this was based in social Darwinism, racism, things like that. So here, Uncle Sam is giving citizenship rights to Puerto Ricans. Now, the thing today, and I think we've already talked about something to say further, Puerto Rico is not a state, but it's still an American territory. However, the citizenship rights and protections that we all are protected by the Constitution do extend. But again, Puerto Ricans don't get the all-important representation in Congress. Now, if tomorrow Puerto Rico becomes our 51st state, that changes everything. We have to shift, we have to completely balance everything. As we rebalance House of Representatives, they've got to get senators, they get electoral college votes. Can you imagine how or changing the electoral college map actually would change elections forever? I mean, it could completely change everything. So, if you wonder why this is such a hot topic, and it comes up every few years, there was an election a couple years ago, I don't remember what year it was, but Puerto Ricans in a referendum overwhelmingly said we want to become a state. It wasn't binding, they just said, let's have a vote to see what you want. I don't remember that. I think it was like 65%, something like that, said, yes, we want to become a state. What did the U.S. government do with that? They just went, okay, and just went on about their merry way. So, it's interesting to talk about, and we will probably talk about it more later, but maybe in our lifetimes we will see this. And if that happens, it could be, in theory, a monumental shift in politics. All right, last slide is this one. I don't want you to think all was good, though. The question then became, this is the final thing, the question then became, when you become a U.S. territory, not a state, when you become a U.S. territory, so we're talking about Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico up until 1917, do you automatically, this is really important, do you automatically become, do the people of those territories automatically become U.S. citizens? That was the question being asked. Now, we didn't have an answer. The U.S. Constitution does not discuss imperialism. We had never intended to have imperialism. The only thing the Constitution talks about is statehood. How do U.S. territories become states? It says really not a whole lot about what about non-states, which tells you that the founders never really considered this. Not really. So this went to courts, federal courts, Supreme Court, federal courts, and they ruled on it in the era. In the beginning of the 20th century, in a series of court cases called the insular cases, you probably want to know that. I don't think this is in your book either, but I think it's worth knowing. In a series of court cases, the United States courts ruled at the time that citizenship rights do not automatically apply to people of U.S. territories. They can apply, but they don't automatically apply, which means, in the beginning, most American territories that were not states did not automatically apply citizenship rights. So, for example, Filipinos did not necessarily, from the get-go, have all the same rights and protections that you and I enjoy under the U.S. Constitution. There was a saying, it says, does the Constitution follow the flag? When we raise our flag over a territory, does it automatically mean the Constitution applies there? The answer at the time was no. Now that has changed today, largely. Okay, today protections do apply. But in the early 20th century, no. And again, why? You can probably come to those conclusions on your own. It probably had a little bit to do with that paternalistic thinking, the fact that most of these people were non-white. Okay? But look again, remember I was just talking about paternalism? Look at this cartoon. What better example? And by the way, I'd like to point out, this cartoon is, you wouldn't tell probably, but it is fairly sympathetic to that cause. So here's Uncle Sam as a teacher in an old schoolhouse. And up front you have all these American territories, non-white territories. And of course, they're being watched very closely by the teacher. And you even see in the back, you have a Native American person in the corner off by themselves, which shows the mistreatment of Native Americans. You see a Chinese caricature in the back, which represents how Chinese were treated in this country in the late 19th century, which was terribly. Chinese Exclusion Act was a terrible law. So this cartoon, even in its era, recognized we treated indigenous people in these territories very differently than we treated the majority white populations on our states, which got full rights and enfranchisement. Okay, so we're going to have to consider that going forward. Okay, so the focus for today, again, what makes it different is now we're entering into the beginnings of the 20th century. We are still going to be talking about foreign policy, and that's largely what we talked about before. We were talking about imperialism, which is foreign policy. But what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about specific foreign policies that occurred for the United States in the early 20th century, and we're going to talk about specific foreign policies based on presidents. So when we're done here today, you should have a little working knowledge of the foreign policies of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. That's going to be one of the focuses of this week, is make sure you're kind of familiar with those presidents as it came back to haunt some of you on the quiz. But don't worry, tomorrow I've got something for you on that should assist you going forward. All right, so the first thing we're going to get to is we're going to start talking about specific actual policies. And yes, you do need to know some of these. Okay, remember you have to have supporting details. So as we enter the 20th century, the United States is now an imperial power. We've talked about the Spanish-American War ushered in the United States as an imperial power. We are now very much involved in the global community. And one of the areas in which the United States began to kind of use its influence was in China. And in 1900, the United States issued, or stated, this new policy, I guess I would say, that they refer to as the open door policy. Okay, this came from Secretary of State at the time, a guy named John Hay. It's also sometimes referred to as the open door notes. But essentially what this was, as you can see from the map, China at the time was kind of a country that was in disarray, and it suffered through some wars and defeats, and really its historical dominance was no more. And as a result, many imperial powers had then moved in and used their power and influence to kind of begin to dominate the Chinese economy. Now, this wasn't traditional imperialism. In most cases, the land itself was not being taken over, but it was more of an economic imperialism, meaning these countries were using their money and their influence to really come to dominate Chinese politics. What the open door policy stated was, and this is the United States telling the world this, mind you, so you imagine the United States is telling everyone else how to behave, The United States basically suggested in 1900 that all nations should have equal access to China, hence the name Open Doors. That the door to China should remain open, propped open, no one should close it, and that everyone should be able to do business and trade with China. Essentially, everyone should be able to take advantage of China and exploit it for their own benefit. And of course, this did not really consider the Chinese too much. Okay? So the main goal here was to block any one single power from eventually coming to dominate China, because China was this huge, lucrative market, and everyone knew that. Everyone wanted to take advantage. So the United States says, hey, let's prop the door open, no one can close it, let's all share in Chinese riches. The problem is the United States has no power to really force countries to obey. Countries can choose to listen to the open door policy or not. Okay? But for the most part, it is safe to say that most countries did respect this. And as you can see, they began to divvy up China into kind of spheres of influence, and they began to profit from that. Now, of course, how did the Chinese react? Well, in response to this increasing foreign dominance in their country, we saw the rise of a new extreme nationalist movement in China. Okay, many Chinese nationals did not like the growing foreign influence that they saw in their country. And rightfully so. I mean, if you were a Chinese person, you would see that this country was increasingly being controlled by foreigners. And you might think, well, why should foreigners profit off of our resources and our hard labor? Shouldn't that go to the Chinese? So in 1900, there was this nationalist uprising that is usually called the Boxer Rebellion. That's what it's most commonly referred to, particularly in the West. And the reason why they call it the Boxer Rebellion kind of goes to the cultural differences between the two. Many of the Chinese nationalists who participated in this uprising against foreigners, that's what it was an uprising to try and overthrow foreign dominance. It was an attack on foreigners and things like that. They practiced Chinese martial arts, traditional Chinese martial arts. And at the time, many Westerners used language that they were familiar with to describe it. So they referred to this as Chinese boxing, right? Because they were fighting, with their fists. Okay? So because of that, the rebellion is oftentimes referred to in the West as the Boxer Rebellion, because many of the Chinese involved in it practiced this Chinese martial arts that they referred to as Chinese boxing. Ultimately, this rebellion, remember, was aimed at expelling foreigners from China. There was attacks on, British and American and German foreigners. There was attacks on Christianity in China, because many of the efforts by the West was to bring Christianity in. There were even attacks on Chinese people who had converted to Christianity because they were seen as now following this kind of foreign religion. Now, in response to the Boxer Rebellion, a multinational military force was put together and sent to China to kind of suppress the uprising and to preserve not only foreign life, but also property. Okay, this turned into a very brutal fight. As you can see from the picture, the United States sent thousands of Marines to China to actually participate. Okay, and again, though the rebellion was eventually put down in a very violent struggle, okay, it basically reaffirmed the fact that for the time being, there will be a strong foreign presence in China and dominance there. So for the time being, this was a failure, and foreign powers will continue on and dominate China. It's really not until after World War II that we see strong foreign influence and dominance in China begin to recede. And then, of course, we enter into the communist era, which you guys might remember learning about last year. Now, all this stuff we're talking about, the open door notes, the involvement in the Boxer Rebellion, this is all part of this growing U.S. involvement in the world. You have to look at it, and I know a lot of you don't have a strong background in this, that's okay. But for most of the 19th century, the United States was fairly, at least in terms of international affairs, fairly isolationist. I mean, we really didn't get too involved in foreign affairs. On occasion we did, but you have to remember, we were going through our industrial development, we fought a civil war, we had to struggle over slavery. So when we look at the 1800s, the 19th century, it was kind of dominated by these other things. And now with them all out of the way, the United States is now becoming this more involved world power. We're abandoning our historic isolationism, and now we're really becoming a major world power like we are today. Now, of all the presidents that we're going to talk about or have talked about, I probably would say that the person most responsible for ushering in the United States into this new kind of, era, okay, or this new philosophy of world dimension was this guy, President Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, Roosevelt was a very strong supporter of U.S. intervention in the world. He was an ardent imperialist. He believed that the United States had this quote-unquote moral duty to spread American ideas, okay, around the world. All right, so he very much was an imperialist. Now, part of that, we have to look at what was his specific foreign policy. Now, there is a phrase or a term that is oftentimes used to describe Roosevelt's foreign policy. I alluded to it last week. Sometimes it's called the big stick policy, named after a very famous phrase. It was from an African proverb that he was a fan of, which said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." And the idea here is this. Yes, you should use diplomacy. That's the speak softly part. Use diplomacy to try and convince countries to do the right thing, what you want them to do. However, if in the event diplomacy doesn't work and people are not listening to words, you've got to have the threat of military force behind it. That's your big stick. Okay, in cartoons like you see here, it is literally represented as a big club. It even says, the big stick. And here you see Roosevelt, this will make more sense here in a minute. There is Roosevelt wading around the Caribbean as if it's a little pond of his own ownership, and he's carrying the big stick. And the real, in the real world, the manifestation of the big stick was this: the United States Navy. Our new modern military naval force is going to kind of be that big stick that's going to back up our threats. And if you go back and look at the United States historically in the 19th century, we did not command a tremendous amount of respect in the global community. Going back to 1823, you remember last week I talked about the Monroe Doctrine. When we issued the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, European countries for the most part just laughed at us. They're like, the United States is telling us what to do? Are you kidding me? You guys are brand new. You're upstarts. You're children, basically. But that's not the case anymore. By the 1900s, the United States was for lack of a better term, superpower. And people had to listen. Now, again, you have to have diplomacy, but you also have to have that military force, right? So in terms of diplomacy, I like to highlight this as an example of how Roosevelt actually backed it up. Roosevelt, he actually walked the walk a little bit in terms of what he was saying. For example, in 1905, this is actually a review from last year, you might passingly remember it. In 1905, the United States helped negotiate what becomes known as the Treaty of Portsmouth, in which President Roosevelt, that's him there, front and center, that's President Roosevelt, he negotiated the end of a brutal war between Russia and Japan, the Russo-Japanese War, in which Japan largely defeated Russian forces, humiliating them, and that led to some of the tensions that would eventually lead to the Russian military buildup that leads to World War I. So this is all going to eventually come together. But why does this matter? Again, this is the speak softly part, right? Roosevelt helped bring peace through words, through diplomacy. He didn't use military intervention here, but he wasn't also shy about that. So when words were necessary, they would do. Here's the case. In fact, actually, Teddy Roosevelt becomes one of the only presidents in American history. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize for this, for helping negotiate the end to this war. Kind of a big deal. Okay, that's a very prestigious honor that very few presidents get. However, at the same time we were preaching peace, we were also preparing for war. Okay, so this chart is actually from your textbook, and it actually breaks down naval tonnage, the size of navies. Now you'll notice, you can look at all the countries, many of them are building up, which is part of that militarism, at least of World War I that you might recall from last year, which we're going to be studying that again next week. But let's focus on the United States for a minute. In 1880, the United States had a relatively small, or at least competitive navy with many of the other powers of the world that might be, of similar influence. Obviously, the Great Britain was the big naval power going back hundreds and hundreds of years. But look how it changed between 1880 and 1914, which is the start of World War I. The United States multiplies its navy. I mean, it's nearly 10 times over, right? Look how much bigger our navy gets. So what Roosevelt did was Roosevelt and other presidents, they subscribed to what other imperialists were saying, like Alfred T. Mahan said, look, a country is only as strong as its navy. If you want to be able to project force around the world, remember, this is the era before air forces and things like that, you got to have a navy. And by the early 1900s, the United States had a massive, modern, steel-hulled navy that was really capable of competing with any other navy in the world. Now, we weren't yet the largest navy in the world like we are today, which we are many times over. There is no one in the world who can even compete with us in terms of the size and strength of our navy today, which I guess is kind of a continuation of this. We've never kind of ceased that build-up. Okay? But we're getting there. That's where we're getting to. Okay? The so-called Great White Fleet, they call it. They had this fleet of brand new ships, with these brilliant white hulls like you see in the picture. And in fact, in 1907, I believe it was, Roosevelt sent them on a worldwide tour to various ports around the world to show them off. And you might think, oh, wow, that's nice. He's showing all these countries. But no. This was gunboat diplomacy. You sail that great white fleet into an adversary's harbor and say, look at what we got. Just remember, next time we do business, you better play ball. So this new modern Navy would really seal the United States' ability to force its policies on other countries if necessary. We are becoming a military superpower like we are today. Which leads us to this. Now, this might be the single most important thing I'm going to talk about today. So we probably want to know that. Now, I talked just a moment ago, I reminded you, last week we talked about the Monroe Doctrine. By the way, that should say 1905, not 19095. So, in 1905, President Roosevelt, here we go again, made a statement that would later become known as the Roosevelt Corollary, or the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, now what is that? So let's remind ourselves what the Monroe Doctrine is one more time. I just talked about it. In 1823, President Monroe he made a statement known as the Monroe Doctrine in which he warned European powers, hey, the United States, the Americas, our hemisphere, it is closed for business. No more colonization, no more European intervention, leave us alone. This is our hemisphere. If anyone's going to meddle around in the American hemisphere, it's going to be the United States, not Europe. Right? And of course, at the time, most countries just said, whatever, say whatever you want, we're going to do what we want. Now, by the early 1900s, though, the United States had the military strength to back up such statements. So Roosevelt decided to modernize the Monroe Doctrine with an additional statement called the Roosevelt Corollary. It's like an addendum. He's going to add on. What he said was, this is the actual quote. You don't have to write all this down. I'll read it to you. Roosevelt said, chronic wrongdoing may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation. And in the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Now, you notice I have highlighted down here international police power, because that's kind of the magic words. So that's a lot of stuff. What's he talking about? So what Roosevelt was saying in the Roosevelt Corollary is, look, in our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, that means, by the way, not just the United States, Roosevelt's saying everything here, North, Central, South America, that's our hemisphere. Any country that resides in that hemisphere, he's now speaking to. And what he's saying is, if countries misbehave, now I know that's a very subjective term, he says if countries misbehave, right, chronic wrongdoing, he says the United States reserves the right to intervene in their affairs. If a country does something we don't like, we have the right to intervene and change that behavior. Even in foreign countries that we have no political control over. And he justifies it based on the Monroe Doctrine. He says, hey, President Monroe said it, and it's gospel, and we're going to follow through. Now, in order to fully understand what he's talking about, you have to know what was going on at the time. Okay? At the time, many Latin American countries, like in the cartoon, Santo Domingo here, many Latin American countries were falling into deeper and deeper debt by borrowing money from European countries. You need money? You go to Europe, you borrow their money, you say, okay, we'll pay you back later. But many of these countries, because they were lesser developed because of their history of colonialism, were unable to pay back their debts. When countries failed to pay back the debts, there was a fear by the United States that those European countries might come over here and by force try to extract those debts. Now, what's the big deal? Well, what the big deal is, if, let's say France, let's pick on France for a second, or Britain, like in the cartoon. If Britain comes over to collect its debts, it might never leave. Which means it might occupy a country until it gets paid, and if it never gets paid, it might just stay there forever, and all of a sudden that country now becomes part of the British Empire. Does everyone follow? That would violate the Monroe Doctrine, because the Monroe Doctrine says, hey, Europeans, you can't come over here anymore. So what Roosevelt says, if a country is doing wrong, like going into debt and not paying their debts, the United States has the right to intervene. Now, the way he justified this, he made it sound really nice. He said, don't worry, Europe. We're going to collect your debts for you. Right? We're going to use our military, the Great White Fleet, and we're going to go to these countries. We're going to take the money from them. We'll get it from them, don't worry. And we're going to hand deliver it to you. And that sounds, wow, that was very generous. How kind of the United States to take on this role. But our purpose was actually very much self-centered in the fact that, hey, by doing this, yeah, it's a pain, But by doing this, it ensures that Britain, France, Germany, all the rest, they stay out of our business because we don't want to meddle with them because they are kind of considered peers. They're powers that can compete with us. We don't want that. We only want to deal with people who are weaker than us and that we can kind of manipulate. Does that make sense? Everyone clear on that? So one more time, the Roosevelt Corollary is the United States taking for itself the right to intervene in the affairs of any country in the Americas. Now, technically, this is any country in the Americas, but in practice, it only applies really to countries south of us. We're not going to intervene in Canadian affairs. We're only really going to intervene in Latin American affairs. All right, and as you can see here, here's another cartoon referring to it. By doing this, the United States had now adopted a new role. We have basically said we are, as this cartoon is referring to, the constable of the world, which constable, if you're not familiar with that term, we're the police, we're the cops. Now, maybe the world's a little bit too grand. I would say that might be more applicable today, but we do try to intervene in the affairs of countries around the world today. But at the turn of the century, we were really more the constable of the Americas. Okay? And there are some other interventions beyond Latin America, so it's probably fair to say the world, but that's a role that's going to grow over the course of the 20th century. Okay? And by the way, we talked about this last year. I remember sitting right here, right over there, actually talking about it. Throughout the course of the 20th century, the Roosevelt Corollary is going to be used as the justification for repeated U.S. intervention in Latin American affairs, all the way up through the Cold War and even to today. Okay, anytime the United States interferes in the affairs of another country in the American hemisphere, you can argue, hey, that's the Roosevelt Corollary. Okay, where it was in Guatemala, we talked about last year with the Cold War, or Chile, right? All those, that's all part of it. You can at least make that argument. Okay, so the only thing standing between Europe over here and the Americas was the United States. Okay, so we are doing this to protect our own interests. Okay, everyone clear on that? Any questions so far? Now, where else? Here's one you might want to know about. One of the areas we would intervene, arguably as part of the Roosevelt Corollary, but just in general for our interest, was in Panama. Now, since the 1800s, I'm talking about like way back, there had been interest shared between the United States and European powers like France and Britain. There had been shared interest in building a man-made waterway, a canal, across the Isthmus of Panama. Why there? Because it was one of the most narrow spots, okay, in the Americas to connect, as you can see, the Atlantic and the Pacific, okay? You probably want to look down here at this little inset to get a better idea, okay? If a country could build a canal here, it would dramatically reduce the amount of time for international commerce and the movement of navies. I mean, look at the world map over there. Prior to this, ships, navies would have to go all the way around South America. However, you cut a canal through Panama, all of a sudden you can just sneak right through there. And the country that controls that canal will have that extra power being able to decide who can go through or not. It's a huge amount of power having that canal. Okay? So this had been debated and talked about all throughout the 19th century. But by the 20th century, the only country that was still really in the running to do this was the United States. Problem was, we did not have the rights to this land to build a canal. Now, let me give you a quick version of events. You need to know this, because this is very much American imperialism. We wanted to build the canal. However, at the time, Panama was part of the country of Colombia. Colombia owned Panama. Colombia would not give the United States the rights to build the canal because the terms of the agreement would favor the United States too much. Basically, the United States would profit off of someone else's territory. They didn't like it. Now, President Roosevelt was not one to take no for an answer. He was outraged that Colombia would not play ball. So, the United States did a time-honored classic. When a country's government will not play ball, we like to overthrow that country's government and find a new government that will. So essentially what ended up happening is in Panama, the United States helped instigate a rebellion in which the Panamanians revolted against their Colombian masters. And when Colombia went to intervene in this revolution, the United States sent our Navy down to Panama, parked them off the coast and said, hey, don't do it. Classic example of gumbo diplomacy. A show of force and intimidation, the legitimization of this new Panamanian government was all it took. Colombia was forced essentially to give in to Panamanian independence, so Panama now becomes independent, and as part of the reward for United States help, essentially, Panama was on the line, they said, all right, we're going to give you contract rights to build the canal. So as a result of U.S. intervention in Panama, we now were able to build the canal, which we went on to do. It was one of the greatest engineering feats of the first half of the 20th century. It's actually a remarkable achievement. It cost many lives, okay? And of course, today, it's still one of the most vital waterways in the world. So that's how the United States got its hands on the Panama Canal. Now, just so for your own personal knowledge, we no longer control the Panama Canal. We have returned the rights over the canal zone back to Panama. Okay, but we did control it for most of the 20th century, and we were largely responsible for its construction. So this is a prime example of American imperialism. It made us more powerful. We intervened in other countries' affairs to our benefit. All right, let's go on to this one now. I don't know why these are all over the place today. Let's talk about President Taft. We talk about Roosevelt. President Roosevelt was an imperialist. No doubt about it. Now, President Taft, William Taft, who followed President Roosevelt, he was actually Roosevelt's vice president. When they were friends, they eventually become political enemies in a very fascinating story that we are not going to get into, though. It's pretty fun, though. President Taft also could be considered an imperialist. However, he was a little different. President Taft had a much softer approach to imperialism than President Roosevelt. Whereas President Roosevelt was more overt with his involvement and direct involvement in countries, President Taft took a little bit different tactic, what he referred to as dollar diplomacy. So dollar diplomacy is President Taft's version of imperialism. So rather than using military force to simply go in and take over countries and dominate them, President Taft argued that the best solution would be to use our economy, our money, and American business interests to control and dominate foreign territories. Now, how would this work? Again, rather than invading countries with military force, rather, we would use our money and businesses to manage the financial affairs of Latin American countries. We would run their banking systems. We would run their economy for them. We would basically tell them, you are going to adopt an economic system very similar to ours. You're going to be capitalist, you're going to be free market, there's going to be free trade, and most importantly, you're going to do business with the United States to our advantage. Okay? This is a form of imperialism. You don't have to use guns. There's lots of forms of imperialism. Remember, imperialism is any way you exert control over a foreign territory. Okay? What else would this do? Well, by managing the finances of foreign countries, we would also ensure that they don't fall into debt. If they don't fall into debt, we don't have to worry about European powers coming over and trying to take them over, which is part of the Roosevelt corollary, right? Also, it would serve our business interests. If we're managing their economies, we're going to be darn sure to make sure that their economic policies favor the United States. Whatever trade agreements we establish with these countries are going to be very profitable to us. Okay? So not only does this help shape countries in our image, which we always like to do, we want countries to look like us because we feel like our system is the best. That's pretty normal. It also would financially benefit us because the trade agreements would probably lean in our favor. Okay? Now, I don't want you to think that President Taft was all peaceful. Okay? When countries balked at the idea of dollar diplomacy, he was not afraid of using the big stick either. On numerous occasions, President Taft oversaw military intervention in Latin American countries. We're going to do more with this tomorrow. Don't worry. If you're like, what countries? I have some of them up there. Don't worry. We're going to do a little exercise of this tomorrow to make it more clear. But just be aware for today, President Taft absolutely used the military to intervene. If you didn't get on board with dollar diplomacy, he would go right back to the big stick real quick, and you would learn. The United States used military intervention tons of times in Latin America. Okay? It's unbelievable how much we were actually intervening in their affairs. But just be aware, if you had to compare and contrast presidents, while Roosevelt and Taft were both imperialists to a certain degree, they varied in their tactics. Everyone clear on that? We got one more president to talk about. How about this guy, Woodrow Wilson? Now, you already know Woodrow Wilson, right? We learned about him last year because he was president during World War I, not II, I. And we're going to revisit that next week. Woodrow Wilson also had his own spin. He called his moral diplomacy. This is a form of imperialism as well. Now, Wilson, unlike his predecessors, Roosevelt and Taft, he was a different party. They were Republicans, he was a Democrat. And by this point in history, because he was elected in 1912, took office in 1913, there were many critics of imperialism. We talked about this the other day. There was an entire anti-imperialist league led by people like Mark Twain, who said imperialism is wrong. It doesn't fit with the Constitution, right? So Woodrow Wilson had to pacify anti-imperialists, many of which were in the Democratic Party at the time, But at the same time, he also had to protect American interests. So he said, okay, how about moral diplomacy? Moral diplomacy was the idea that we would only really work with countries that reflected our own views and our own ideas about economies and government. Basically, the United States, under Wilson, would promote in Latin American countries representative democracies like our own. We said, hey, we have the best form of government on earth. You better adopt it. It's the only way to do it. Okay? This is part of this concept that in American history is sometimes referred to as American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is this idea that Americans are just exceptional at all things, and everything we do is great, and others should mimic that. Okay? So Wilson said, hey, our democratic system is the best. Our capitalistic free market system is the best. You should do it too. And if you don't, well, maybe we won't work with you. And at worst, if you don't work with us, maybe we have to work against you. Okay? You got the carrot and the stick. You can be nice and lure them along with the carrot, but if they don't, you got that stick, right? Yeah.
And at this point, are there because we've gone through, we've been imperialist for a while by the time.
Yeah, a few decades at least, yeah.
So is that why instead of being oh, if you don't want to work with us, we're just gonna whatever, instead it's the threat of not helping them anymore would be worse because a lot of countries became dependent?
Absolutely, especially in Latin America, because remember, we have limited how much Europeans were allowed to get involved because of their debts. So basically the only game in town now really was the United States. And remember, we were more developed, and you think, well, why? Why are they so... Listen, I don't want to get the whole thing this, but a lot of these countries we're talking about were very underdeveloped. They're still underdeveloped compared to us. And a lot of that has to do with the history of colonialism. Listen, if for hundreds and hundreds of years, a country exploits your people and resources exclusively to better themselves at your own expense, it's going to take you a long time to crawl out of that hole. And even to this day, in 2022, right, a lot of these countries are still struggling on their own because of that history of colonialism. So they really depend on American foreign investment. So yeah, the threat of us taking away our investment, I mean, that's like a gun to the head. And you look at this cartoon, this kind of sums it up. We're teaching, the idea is we have to teach, and a lot of this is that moral judgment we talked about last week with social Darwinism. This idea that we're the best, you're backwards, that's the kind of idea here. We have to teach you. It's paternalistic again. Look, why these cartoons I keep showing you, I didn't even think about this till now, but why these cartoons that I keep showing you are Latin American countries, foreign countries, particularly non-white ones, why are they constantly being represented like children? Because that was the American view of them. Anyone who did not have our exact same culture, race, religion, or government or economic system was seen as being wrong. And they had to be instructed in the right way, which is the American way. And that can be considered very offensive if you're from these countries. Hence why, even to this day, the United States doesn't always have a positive reputation in every country, because there's a history here where some people still go, hey, we remember, you guys did these things. Now, Wilson, as much as like Taft, he sounds like he's being nice and he's not using military force. Even Wilson, who claimed to be kind of quasi-anti-imperialist to get votes, he also had to intervene. When he found out very quickly, just telling countries, you need to follow our model without the threat of force, that ain't going to work. So even during Wilson, you can look at some of these years, and again, I said we're going to do an activity tomorrow about this. On numerous occasions, even under Wilson, we intervene in the affairs of Latin American countries who, in this case, may not have adopted American democracy, or they might not have adopted free market capitalism. It was either, you better emulate what we're doing or else. And even more so, if the free market capitalism that you emulate better favor the United States. Your trade agreements, right? If someone's going to benefit from them, it better be the United States. Otherwise, you might get an occupation. I mean, in some cases here, we had U.S. military forces occupying these countries for years, just sitting there. Because if they tried to rise up and rebel, we would quickly overthrow their government and install a government that was more American-friendly. Now, one of the most overt examples of this, in a way, was in Mexico, which was actually shown on the previous map. Mexico in the early 1900s was kind of a mess. Okay, corruption in the government had led to a lot of unrest and upset people. There were revolutions going on in which various factions were vying for control. I mean, the Mexican government over the course of a couple decades went through numerous leadership changes. Some of them would be considered illegal changes. One person might be democratically elected, but the next might take power by force. And the question becomes, well, do we recognize them? So this is something the United States really struggled with. Now, President Wilson, he inherited most of these problems because during his presidency, there were some major violent issues going on in Mexico as various factions vied for control. And President Wilson did not like that one of the governments that gained control over Mexico, the government under President Huerta, had seized control through military force. He said, hey, that doesn't reflect democratic values that we do. So President Wilson used the United States power to try to influence events even in Mexico, our closest neighbor, right? So for example, you can see there's the cartoon, our eyes are on them, we're watching Mexico. One of the things that President Wilson did as part of our foreign policy was he for a time launched an arms embargo where we would no longer freely sell weapons to the Mexican government because we had questions about whether it was legitimate or good or whether it was U.S. friendly. We cut them off. Okay? And this was designed to hurt the existing government in favor of some of the more upstarts that were trying to gain control. So Mexico was just an absolute mess. And you can read about this more in your book, the various factions, Carranza and Huerta. Okay? But at the height of this chaos, some of this violence eventually crossed over the border to the United States. Okay? There was a Mexican revolutionary known as Pancho Villa who started off as kind of an ally of the United States. We actually hoped that he would actually maybe facilitate regime change in Mexico in our favor. But when the United States government began to throw its support behind another Mexican leader that Villa did not agree with, Pancho Villa decided to take action himself. And in military operations, Villa led really a terrorist attack on American soil. He actually crossed over the border, something that would have seemed unthinkable that Mexico would do this. But Pancho Villa and his bandits, they crossed over the border in the United States and they actually attacked American settlements, killing American citizens. Okay? Now, the fact that the violence in Mexico had now crossed the border in the United States, this was the first time that we had really a direct attack on our soil. And this gave us, really, in many ways, legal right to intervene. So, in 1916, the United States actually sent a military force into Mexico. We invaded Mexico. We had not really done this significantly, I guess I should say, since the Mexican-American War, way, way back when. Okay? We sent what was called the punitive expedition. We were there to punish. We were there to punish Mexico for allowing Pancho Villa, this terrorist, essentially, okay, for doing this. Now, here's the kind of crazy thing. We sent thousands of troops into Mexico. We marched all over the deserts of northern Mexico looking for Pancho Villa. We never got him. We actually never captured him. You know, one of the most serious terrorist attacks, you could say, maybe in American history. But we never actually succeeded. And there's a reason for that. Look at the years. What else is going on? World War I's going on. Now remember, when World War I broke out in 1914, we said, no, this ain't our fight, we're neutral. But remember, this is going back to last year now, as things went on, we were slowly but surely getting sucked into the fight. Right? And eventually we had to take our eye off Mexico. When we realized very quickly, like, hey, we got more pressing concerns, we need to call those troops back home and get ready because we might have to go to war in Europe. In fact, the general who led the punitive expedition into Mexico was John Pershing. John Blackjack Pershing, that was his nickname. John Pershing would later go on to be the general in command of the American Expeditionary Force in World War I. Same guy. Same guy who went after Pancho Villa and didn't get him, unfortunately, to the United States, then led the war in Europe. So in 1917, the United States enters World War I. Okay? And for a time, we're going to have to ignore our other imperialist concerns. But there is even an argument to be made that U.S. participation in World War I, as part of our foreign policy, is imperialist. You could argue that because again, this is last year, a reminder. Woodrow Wilson said in 1917, when we joined the war, the United States was joining World War I, not to take land, not for reparations. You guys all remember this, right? He said specifically, this is a war to defend democracy. He said democracy is under attack. In our case, we were directly under attack. He said, we're to defend democracy. And if you look at it a certain way, he's promoting democracy around the world, which is kind of that moral diplomacy that we just talked about. So there's an argument to be made, I don't know that I would make it, but there is an argument to be made that U.S. participation in World War I is part of American imperialism, but it is certainly part of American foreign policy. I mean, that is without a doubt, because what is more foreign policy than declaring war on a country? I don't know that there is. All right, so that is what we're going to start talking about next week. Is we're going to go back to World War I, and we're going to talk about not just the United States, but we're going to talk about any American country, like Canada, for example. Canada was very much involved in World War I. We've got to talk about that.